Hi folks, David Jamieson here, editor of Conter.scot. I'm having a wee blether today with Sean Baillie, who's a member of our editorial board and a trade unionist, about an article he wrote for our site yesterday. I'll post down below, about the situation at Bi-Fab, the planned work there on wind farms having collapsed, trade unions say, after the Scottish government refused to underwrite a new contract. Sean Baillie, just tell us first of all what's going on there, what's the background, and what's the significance?
Yep, so I suppose the kind of big issue here is that there was two major wind farm sites are about to be built on the off the coast of Scotland. Total funding or total costing for these projects over £5 billion. So there's a lot of work within that, a lot of money to be made in there. And the big question for us and for people working and living in Scotland is where that money went, or who's got it, who's the beneficiaries, what kind of jobs does that create? In 2010, the Scottish Government released their own paper that stated that by 2020, this year, there'd be 130,000 jobs created in the renewable sector and low carbon sector. G&B Scotland have got a report on the green energy crisis, the kind of amount of jobs, and they estimate, using the Office for National Statistics information, that there's been around 30,000 jobs created to date. So it kind of shows the disparity between the slogans and the messaging and the reality on the ground. In this particular incident, I think it is central and key because it did have the potential and so much promise to really kick off a new green industrial revolution, or a Green New Deal, which is ultimately full of great messages, and it's a lot of great work by good people who's been put in it. But I do feel that there's an element of it being co-opted by the political class and plagiarised almost for their own benefit, and the action's not living up to reality. So this £5 billion contract, or these contracts, there was a hope that even just a fraction of the work would be built and made in Scotland in the Bi-Fab yards. There's two in Fife, one in Arnish, and they were holding out for around 500 jobs. The total cost and the total projection for these infrastructure projects would deliver thousands of jobs, but there was a holding out with a realisation that we weren't going to get the thousands, but we might get 500. And what's happened the last week is that the Scottish Government were asked, as one of the biggest shareholders in the Bi-Fab, to underwrite the project, to give it a bit of security, and apparently the Scottish Government ministers walked away from the table. So throwing away those 500 jobs in the communities that rely on them.
And of course, the Scottish Government say that this is partly because of rules, state aid, EU state aid rules that allow and don't allow them to offer money to the companies to choose winners in the kind of language of economics. But this, in your article, you kind of make the argument that ultimately this comes down to a question of will. Like, if we're using language like Green New Deal, that invokes the New Deal in the United States and big industrial transformation and stuff like that, you have to be prepared for conflict with institutional forces or class actors that won't like what you're doing. And if the will's not there, chuck the rhetoric about a Green New Deal or a just transition, because you're not going to make a meaningful transition of any kind.
Absolutely not. It's not going to be just, and it's not even going to be a transition if you're relying on the same economic model and strategy. So in the article, I'll lead off with a quote from Alex Hammond when he talks about how he's often attributed by saying that Scotland will be the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. And he actually says the father of renewable energy in Scotland was a Labour MP called Tom Johnson from Dundee. And during the Second World War, and I can remember this was a prelude, or during the Spirit of 45, the big social democratic infrastructure projects, he had to take on landed aristocratical interests and challenge them and use the compulsory purchase orders in order to get infrastructure projects built. So you're like, that thing again, it's a question of not only political will, but a realisation that there will need to be a degree of political and economic conflict, of actually challenging and entering that arena, rather than shying away from it and being too scared to make those arguments. And the idea that we can rely on the market or green capitalists or green philanthropists to deliver and ultimately save the world from climate catastrophe. And that whole ideology, or that whole train of thought, I think has been found lacking, particularly recently when we go into the period we're in, both historically, economically, but there's a culmination of kind of three huge issues, I think, which are going to end up becoming the one, or if we play our cards right off, there's a potential there for real radical transformative change if we can make the arguments across the three. So you've got the issue of independence, the COVID economic recovery, and the pending climate catastrophe that's coming our way, and we need to meet those challenges with visions and ideas and scope that is up to the challenge.
Yeah,
and we've not seen that leadership happening.
Yeah,
we're doing it.
And you're right to kind of link this to the independent stuff as well. There's something that strikes me about this and about the connected issue of, you know, the renewables portfolio, that Scotland's renewable assets are already being sold to the highest bidder. And of course, the whole story of Bi-Fab's built into this question of kind of globalization and the offshoring of jobs. You know, the plan that is clearly emerging is to have Scotland's renewables sector built by multinational corporations, and not necessarily, you know, even employing workers in Scotland and so on, let alone returning the profits of that industry back into Scottish communities. And I think, because you always get these arguments in the independence movement is, well, we'll sort all this out once we're independent. But, you know, our national assets are already being sold off. That creates serious problems for an independent country. And this is all connected, like, you know, people use words like sovereignty and so on. We're literally selling away the very stuff of the country. The wind power, the wave power, the solar power. We're selling away the elements of the country to multinational corporations who, as I say, they're not going to turn over the profits or the control of this stuff back into the country.
No, absolutely not. And I think if we look back to the campaign leading up to the independence referendum, and even afterwards, there was a lot made of our natural resources and the potential wealth that's inherent within them, and what could be done with them. And even in kind of industrial history, I mind speaking to, I worked offshore for a wee bit, and I mind speaking to an old guy in the pub before I went offshore first trip. He's sitting and he said that, big man, more money's been through Aberdeen, more oil money's been through Aberdeen than has been through Dubai. If you look at Dubai today, look at Aberdeen. And he says, don't get your hopes up, it's not the promised land. It wasn't right, but a lot of that in certain sectors, and it's been the biggest critique of the independence movement, I suppose, is that the economic strategy was based on oil price. And if we look at the catastrophic failure of the economic strategy around the oil industry, as much as we've got world leaders and a strong economy, when it's strong in Aberdeen, the city's infrastructure, or the wider community's infrastructure is still lacking. It took 40 years to build a city bypass. When you look at the kind of growth and physical infrastructure in Dubai, off the back of it, you look at other states in Europe that have used sovereign wealth funds to really underpin their social security in the country for 300 years in the future, I think I read. And also where they're investing that money and how they're underwriting different projects in the country. And so we missed that opportunity with oil, and we want to move away from that. And we really do want to move to a greener future. But it has to be tied to these same feelings of these infrastructure projects and the building not only an independent state for the future, but building the type of society and social infrastructure that will maintain a healthy and positive standard of living going forward. And there's an argument that we've missed the boat with renewable energy, particularly wind power already, because you've got these massive projects undergoing with no physical infrastructure being built. So there was a hope, I think, tied to these projects that there would be state-of-the-art training centres built to help transition from the workers that were building this project could then retrain into other jobs in the future, or even folk that work in the offshore oil industry could transition and retrain into this or future work that would be left as a generational thing that could be used for the children of the workers as well. And it would provide an economic path for future generations. But you've also got supply chains and a whole swathe of Scotland that's been deindustrialised, that is brownfield sites, that there's infrastructure money there, and it's not been tied together. There's no coherent thinking.
Yeah.
Space. So
and
the argument
if we were serious about a just transition, that's the kind of stuff you'd be seeing. You'd be seeing a huge growth in, like you say, like wider educational infrastructure and stuff like that. There would be an assumption that you'd have to kind of relaunch that transition at several points. Do you know what I mean? You might invest in one project for offshore wind, but it doesn't carry jobs for more than 10 or 15 years or something. And then you have to reinvest into something else. Like the point that comes across really strongly in your article, like the Tom Johnson stuff, is this takes like a big push from the state, from the collective assets of society, to realign into new fields of industrial development, and yeah, it needs to force through the barriers. It's not the kind of thing that the market's going to do, because the market doesn't have those. It's not going to outlay those concentrations of wealth into risky ventures, or something that has a broader vision than immediate profit making, and so on. I think the oil thing's a really good point as well. Like, you've obviously been in Aberdeen. Like, see, if you walk down Union Street in Aberdeen today, one thing that you're really aware of is there's a lot of wealthy people on a high street where half the shops are closed. And that's the image of kind of corporate globalization. And you're going to end up with the same thing in places like Fife. You're going to end up with banks and, corporate headquarters are going to relocate to Scottish cities and Scottish towns. In Aberdeen, by the way, in many items, inflation is higher than Edinburgh. Because of like the number of rich people who live in Aberdeen, they're there to oversee the oil industry. But at the same time, there's chronic poverty in Aberdeen. So you're going to see the same sight of like people being priced out, but average wages not considerably increasing at the same time as these industrial developments happen. It's so strange in a country where, it's Scotland's oil, this kind of idea of, we didn't get the sovereign wealth fund that Norway did. We missed out on all this development because of the way Thatcher used the oil revenues basically to fund high unemployment. And we missed the oil bonanza. And you think, well, yeah, but we're missing another one that's right under our noses right now. And the same processes and the same forces are carving up those assets.
Aye, and it's heartbreaking. If I'm honest, it's quite scary, and it's a source of general frustration for a lot of people. So, as you said, there's been moments in recent history that the driving force has been big, ideological, but also infrastructure projects. So we referenced Roosevelt's New Deal, which had to take on degrees of vested interests and had to raise taxes, and that kind of maybe bled into the post-war period social democratic infrastructure projects came after the Second World War, not only in the UK but across Germany with the aid of US investment, but it was very much state building. So we're talking about what is the future, what is this new phase, and we all agree that there has been a degree of rupture and there's going to be a new phase of society. I suppose, where are we going? What direction are we going to take now? Is it going to be a crumbling post-empire state, or do we want to build an independent Scotland? But we need to build an independent state with independent state infrastructure. And the current evidence does not suggest that. It suggests that it's going to be tied very much to the same vested interests. Almost, in some ways, you start to think that is the strategy, that the strategy is to get international support. We need to open up and sell off our natural assets again and our people. So like the EU is a trading bloc. They were very much tied to the idea that we can rejoin or independent Scotland were part of EU. The EU's history as a force has been, when it spreads eastward, the post-Soviet states, has been to its new markets to create debt, and the kind of inflation and interest that comes off of that helps suck financial capital out from the periphery into the centre. Is that the basis of a post-independent Scotland's economic strategy? That will boost part of the deal is that we'll get international support, become independent, try and join the EU, and say, look, we have all these natural resources, send your big hitters in to take them.
Yeah,
and
it's a nightmare image where it's like, our assets are open to you, including unquantifiable stuff like the wind. Do you remember when, because there's obviously been big news in Bolivia in the last couple of weeks with the election victory there, but one of the things that started off that movement that brought Evo Morales to power, if I'm right, was attempts to privatise rainwater. So they privatised water, people started collecting the rainwater, and then they introduced laws saying you can't do that. It's a very similar vibe now that we're privatising our wind. But but that's the fear, that the offer to the world of an independent Scotland is going to be, come to Scotland, we'll let you buy everything up, all the natural assets. The labour pool is relatively cheap and highly educated. And what's more, our people are in debt. You know what I mean? There's kind of a nightmare vision. What's the alternative then, right? If we could turn things around now, starting with Bi-Fab, what should people in Scotland be looking for in terms of our energy future?
I suppose a degree of a democratic and social control of not only resources, but providing infrastructure to help manage those resources that does create wealth that can then be redistributed and held within the communities, to invest in people as well as infrastructure using that natural wealth, rather than it being used as a bargaining chip and sold off and extracted. And it's the same things happening across the Scottish economy in a lot of ways. I kind of reference it slightly in the article, and I didn't want to go too far in it, but when we look at across the UK, and it's a legacy of not only Thatcher governments but New Labour, and almost at certain times the SNP is a continuation of it. They're a version to have even just the argument or disagreement with vested interests. So if we look at council housing over the last 30, 40, 50 years, how that was one of the big infrastructure projects post-war. It's all been sold off to greater degrees in England, other parts of the UK, but in Scotland, there was still a large proportion was sold through right to buy, and I think the last figures I read was that a third of that is now rented out by private landlords. So it's made the transition from public infrastructure to private infrastructure, which then is another extracted mechanism to extract wealth from people again. Even the stock transfers, there was big fights against the stock transfers for various reasons of public housing. So in Glasgow, we've got to the stage where the City Council does not own one single domestic property, but it still has the statutory obligations to house homeless people. So that's why we see the problems that are there. But also what happened was it transferred that stock to social landlords, and there is a difference between social and public ownership. But in essence, what it did is it flattened around 50,000 properties across the city. It cleared large areas of the city centre. So this has also happened 2 or 3 times. You clear the population, the urban population, that community urban areas through displacement from more rural areas to feed industry. Industry gone, so you've got all these people left that there's no reason for them to be there, no economic reason almost for them to be there. So then you try and clear them out and you reduce your tax base. So now you've got these areas where they're trying to entice private investors and to make private developments in inner city areas and change the names and the history. And it's almost that same process of just people and that redistribution is an afterthought. So we need to stop that. And how we do that is public ownership and public control, or a democratic accountability of resources, institutions, infrastructure. And there's a lot of good stuff that has been already built up, like the Commonweal stuff, the National Investment Bank and other projects. But how much is this, does it still remain at the playground of policy geeks, I suppose is the best way to say it. How do we get that to branch out into further fields? Does there need to be a degree of mass outreach to reach people who it will directly affect the most, and allow them to have a realisation of their own political agency over this situation, and it's in their interest, and what can they build in their own interest, and what institutions, organisations can they create to ensure that their voices are heard, and it's not just the domain of policy, a policy argument in a boardroom or a Zoom call at the minute. What is that process going to look like, and how do we do it? So how do we join the great thinking, great policy ideas to, I suppose, a mass movement or a sustainable organisation of the people that will directly affect, and then what political agency can they exert in a situation to counterbalance the vested interest that we talk about, and then that will create maybe the degree of class conflict on these issues, rather than relying on a political class who we've said will co-opt the slogans and plagiarise them, but don't have the will or even the confidence and the backing to make the arguments in the same way that people will do if it's directly affecting their daily lives.
Aye. All right. Cheers for that, Sean. Lots to think about there. And you can read more about this issue at conter.scot and subscribe to this channel. Like and subscribe, I believe they say. And we'll keep debating these issues in future. I'll speak to you all soon.